Thank you very much. Okay, so let's just talk about yesterday. We had Mr. Glynn. He presented to us two arguments for God's existence. We had the kalam and we had the argument from design. I'm going to present today the argument from contingency. And then we'll have a bit of time to work on our folio, answer some questions about what we're talking about today. And then on Friday, we're going to look at the inverse argument. So here we've got some arguments for God. On Friday, we're going to have a look at some arguments for atheism, so the non-existence of God, the affirmation that God does not exist. So just on that, if we think about our Philosopher's Creed, we're not trying to make you think one way or the other. Really, we just want to challenge our beliefs. And what we want to do is we want to have good reasons for what it is that we believe. Okay, so we're just trying to present as fair and as objective, Miriam, an argument here as possible. So it was interesting when I was running around yesterday, and I'm chatting to people, and lots of people will make this claim. They'll say, I don't believe in God, but I believe in a higher power, or I believe there's something out there. They sort of use that sort of bit vague, bit ambiguous language. Lots of people, I reckon 80% of people would say that. And I think that's because when they think of God, they think of all of the baggage that comes with it. Okay, so they say, if I believe in God, that means I have to believe in the Bible, or I have to believe in Jesus, or I have to follow the Quran. So that's not what we're arguing for here. We're trying to separate all of that out from it, and ultimately all we mean is a creator. Some mind, some intellect outside of the universe, so it's immaterial, that created the universe. So the only thing I would really add from what Mr. Glynn said yesterday is simple. Okay, so simple means it's not composed of parts. Simple doesn't mean easy to comprehend. It means it's only one entity. It's not composed of parts, like you are composed of parts. You've got arms and legs and atoms that make up your body. You're composed of lots of little parts. So simple meaning not composed of parts. And the other one is not just a being, like I'm a being and you're a being and the table is a being in a way, but the source of all being, in that everything that exists derives its existence from God. Okay, so like a good analogy might be an apple tree, which is why I've put that there. Okay, so if existence is the apple, everything that exists is the apple, well, it gets its existence from the source of the apple, is the apple tree. Okay, so I'm going to try and take you back to maybe your childhood a little bit. This author here, David Bentley Hart, okay, he's the most articulate and lucid author I've ever read. All right, and I think what he says, it can bring back memories of childhood, of wonder, of that eerie sense of wonder. All right, so I'm going to read about a page, but I just want you to sort of try and absorb the words, absorb the language, and say, what is he? Don't even think too much about it. It's just going to it should take you back. The beginning of all of philosophy, according to both Plato and Aristotle, lies in the experience of wonder. It is the sudden awareness that no mere fact can possibly be an adequate explanation for the mystery in which one finds oneself immersed at every moment. It is this astonishing recollection of something one has forgotten only because it is always present. A primordial agitation of the mind and will, an abiding amazement that lies just below the surface of conscious thought, and that only in very rare instances breaks through into ordinary awareness. It may be that when we are small children, before we have learned how to forget the obvious, we know this wonder in a more constant, innocent, and luminous way, because we are simply more trusting to the sheer inexplicable givenness of the world. It is in this startling wonder that one realizes that everything about the world that seems so unexceptional, so drearily predictable, is in fact charged with an imponderable mystery. In that instance, one is aware, even if the precise formulation eludes one, that everything one knows exists in an irreducibly gratuitous way. What is it has no logical connection with the reality that it is. Nothing within experience has any right to be, any power to give itself existence, any apparent why. The world is unable to provide an account of its own actuality, and yet there it is all the same. In that instance, one recalls that every encounter with the world is always an encounter with an enigma that no mere physical explanation can resolve. One cannot dwell infinitely in that moment, of course, any more than one can remain a child forever. For one thing, there is an almost paralyzing fullness to the experience, an absolute remoteness from practical things. So I read this book a couple of years ago, and when I read that just made me think, gee, I know that sort of feeling, and that's where philosophy begins. That's the first line that he has. Who's had sort of an experience like that before? They think, gee, this is a really weird existence, and sort of those odd existential thoughts. What is it? What's all this got to do? So that's that sort of sensation of wonder. And this argument that I'm presenting today is just based off that question, and maybe you've sort of entertained that thought before. Why is there something? Okay, why is you could extend it to the universe? You could say it's just you and your mind, and everything else is a creation. But why is there something when there could just as easily be nothing? It could just be nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? And so that's sort of the basis of this argument, the argument from contingency. Because the space between being and non-being, if you think there's existence and then non-existence, is qualitatively infinite. It's very difficult to comprehend what nothingness is. Okay, so let's make a case then for what's called the principle of sufficient reason. So this is, I believe, is written on the back of our notes book. This is going to be a metaphysical principle that we refer to. So I'm going to make a bit of a case for it. This is it here. All things that exist have a reason for their existence. There's a number of formulations of it. This is a pretty straightforward one. So I've got a couple of examples. The apple, all right. The apple exists because of the tree. The Grand Canyon exists because of the erosion of the river. Elon Musk exists because the aliens decided to build a robot that looked like a human. But the point is, anything that exists has a reason for its existence. You can almost think of it like a cause. It's like a cause, but it's not the same as a cause in that all causes are sufficient reasons, but not all sufficient reasons will be causes. Here's another example. Let's say you're walking through the forest, you and your buddies out for a stroll, and you're walking down a path, and then something appears in front of you. This odd sort of glowing energy ball. An orb, it's just sort of sitting there. You're like, what is that? But you immediately suppose it has some reason for its existence. Could be someone's playing a prank on you. It could be the mushrooms you ate earlier. You're having a hallucination. It could be that aliens have come and put it there. But either way, you suppose there is some reason this bowl has popped up in front of you. Okay, so everything we are surrounded by, we always suppose that it has a reason for being, a reason for its existence. So here's three arguments I'm going to make why we should accept PSR as obvious. The first is that we've got incredible inductive evidence to believe it's true. So remember when we've spoken about inductive reasoning is where we see lots of examples of something and then we assume it's truth from that, okay? So I'm a teacher, I drink coffee. Mr. Glynn's a teacher, he drinks coffee. Miss Carol's a teacher, she drinks coffee. And so you might infer from that all teachers drink coffee. We can look at all the things we're surrounded by and we can see they have a reason for their existence. Okay, so we can infer this principle applies to everything that exists. So that's the first one. We've got great inductive evidence to support it. The second is that if you reject PSR, that means you're going to have, I'm going to use PSR for principle of sufficient reason. If you reject PSR, that means you reject all of science, okay? Because what does science hold as what we're going to say is axiomatic? That means it assumes in all of its operations is the universe is intelligible. There is rhyme, there is reason. We can discover how the world operates, okay? The tides rise and fall because of the pull of the moon, all right? So we can think of reasons for things, and so that's what science is about. And so if you reject PSR, you have to reject science. But not only that, if you're going to reject PSR, then you have to have a radical skepticism about all perception whatsoever. So I might say, here's a book, it's in my hand. How do I know there's a book in my hand? It's because my sense organs tell me there's a book in my hand. So I'm even supposing there's a reason I'm having that experience. The reason I'm having the experience is because it's there. If you say there's no reason or rhyme to anything, then none of your senses can tell you anything whatsoever. Any experience you have to mistrust completely. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's why we should accept PSR, all right? So we've got good inductive evidence to support it. The world seems to operate to it. If we believe science can tell us truth, then we believe that there is rhyme and reason to what's going on around us. And if we reject it as well, then we have to be skeptical about everything, okay? All right, so here's the argument from contingency. It's 2 stages. The first stage is pretty non-controversial. Stage 1, all things that exist have a reason for their existence. That's just the statement of the principle of sufficient reason. All things that exist have a reason for their existence. Here's the second premise. The universe exists. Okay, and then the conclusion is going to be, therefore the universe has a reason for its existence, whatever it might be. Okay, think of that bowl that you encountered on the footpath, that orb, okay? Doesn't matter how big it is, whether it's really tiny or super massive like the size of the universe, you still suppose that it's got some reason for its existence. So there will be room to contest this a little bit later on. So all we've established so far is there is some reason for the universe existing. So then let's look at some possible reasons. So the first one might be it just exists. It's just a brute fact that the universe exists. Now, the problem with a brute fact, any idea of a brute fact, is going to be a rejection of PSR, because this is what a brute fact entails. I'm going to say, I've got a bookshelf here, why are the books staying up? Why aren't they falling to the ground? And you say, well, it's because the bookshelf's there, the bookshelf's holding them up. Okay, why is the bookshelf there? Oh, it's just a brute fact. If you say that, you haven't explained anything, because the location of the books depends on the bookshelf. And if the location of the bookshelf is just a brute fact, well, it's just a brute fact that the books are there. You haven't explained anything whatsoever. So it needs some ground. So to say it's a brute fact is to reject PSR, okay? Brute facts don't have reasons. We can read some scientists propose ideas like quantum foam. The quantum foam and the quantum vacuum, that's what caused the universe to come into being. But the problem with these kinds of arguments is that it begs the question, well, why does the quantum foam exist? What reason does the quantum foam have to exist? We could say it's a multiverse, that our universe is just a subset of the massive multiverse where there's billions and gazillions of other universes, sort of different from ours, but maybe similar. Begs the question again, why does the multiverse exist? We heard yesterday, Aidan, you said a void or a vacuum. So Lawrence Krauss, who's a neuroscientist, says, not a neuroscientist, a cosmologist, sorry. He says we can make a universe from nothing. And when he says nothing, he means quantum vacuum with laws of physics. So it's like, well, why does the vacuum exist? Why do the laws of physics exist in that quantum vacuum? You could say it exists because it's a simulation. Okay, but again, it begs the question, why does the simulation exist? Even if we live in a simulation, these metaphysical questions apply to some fundamental level of reality. They apply to the real world at some point. So you can say, why does the simulation exist? Oh, it's because there's a computer. Why is it computer? You can keep asking the question up and up and up until we get to that fundamental level of reality. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's what we're getting to. And so this argument proposes the answer is God. Why is God different from these other 5 proposals? You might be able to think of others. I'm going to say The difference is the top 5 are contingent, whereas God is what we call a necessary being. So that's some new language for us, and that's going to be a little bit confusing, but to say that something is contingent means it gets its existence from somewhere else. It does not justify its own existence. Okay? We're going to contrast that with necessary, that it does justify its own existence. So if you can just entertain the idea of God, right, as something that is outside of the universe, so not a part of the universe, outside of or external to it, it's difficult to think it in that kind of language, that is all powerful, okay? If it's all powerful, then it can't be caused by something else. It maintains that power in itself. And so the sufficient reason of God is not found in something external to God. It's in his own nature, in God's own nature as God, as the source of all being. So look at this line here. You know, I've entertained quantum foam, multiverse, or world. You substitute any of those words where I've highlighted world there. The difference between God and the quantum foam is not that one has an explanation and the other lacks it, but rather that one is self-explanatory and the other is not. One depends on something else to explain it. One explains its own existence. Or another analogy, it makes perfect sense to ask, what is it that illuminates an object? Okay, so you've got the street lights shining on the road. What illuminates the object? Well, the street lights. What illuminates light? Well, that's a silly question. Light is the source of illumination, okay? What gives the universe existence? Well, God. God is the source of all being. What gives the source of all being being? It is the source of all being. It's necessary existence. So here's the second stage of the argument, and this is where people do contest it. Okay? So the first premise says the reason for the existence of the universe cannot be contingent. Okay? So at some level, there must be some foundation. There must be something that's necessary. And the only necessary being is God. The only non-contingent being is God. Therefore, God's the reason for the existence of the universe. Now, I want to point out why this is different from the kalam argument. Okay, if you think of the kalam argument that Mr. Glynn presented yesterday, that was very temporal. Okay, it was event A happened, Big Bang, caused event B, caused event C, caused event D, and we can trace that all the way back and say, well, there must be something that pushed that first domino over, that got the ball rolling. Okay, and so if you were to think of the kalam argument in terms of a coffee cup, if I'm going to say, why does the coffee cup exist? You say, well, we dug some clay up from the riverbed and we moulded it into the shape we want, and then we put it in the oven and cooked it, and then we've got this cup. So there's a temporal sequence of events. Okay, so that's the kalam argument. But this argument here from contingency does not depend on time at all. Okay, it's saying, why does the coffee cup exist here and now? And you could appeal to, you can't appeal to anything in the past, because then we're going into kalam. We're saying, why does it exist here and now? You say, well, it exists because the atoms that make it up exist. Okay? Why do the atoms exist? Well, because they're made up of quarks. They're made up of even smaller things. Why do the quarks exist? And so this is the current quantum physics at the moment, is string theory, where it says everything's these really tiny vibrating strands of strings, and there's 11 spatial dimensions. And so it's like, well, why do the strings exist? Okay, so it doesn't matter how many levels you propose, the question remains. Why does it exist? We can think of it in terms of a chandelier. Okay, chandelier hanging from the ceiling. There it is. You could think of that as you could think of that as the coffee cup, you could think of that as the universe. Why is it there? What's holding it in existence? What's holding it there? Say the atoms. Okay, so we've added a little bit of a chain there. So what holds the atoms in existence? The quarks. Oh, well, what holds the quarks in existence? You can see this is a big chain here. Oh, it's the strings. Well, what holds the strings in existence? What grounds them? It's all a simulation, bro. Okay? No, there must be something fundamental that gives existence to all things, that attaches it to, that it all derives its being from. And the argument proposing here is that it's God. Okay, so if we can answer yes to these three questions, then we can affirm belief in a creator. Remember, this is not committing you to belief in the Bible. It's not committing you to belief in the Quran. It's just saying, well, probably something created the universe. Does existence require an explanation? According to PSR, if we're to accept PSR, yes. Must this explanation be non-contingent? Okay? So this is what we're going to discuss. I'm going to argue, yes, it has to be. Because if it's contingent, then it itself requires an explanation outside of itself. For a reason to be contingent means it requires an explanation. So it has to be necessary. So this might be where we can test it. Is the only non-contingent being, the only necessary being, God? And if the answer is yes, then we're there. So we've presented three arguments here, and I'm just going to talk about why, it's not that one of these arguments is going to convince you that God exists or that, there is a creator out there. I'm going to talk about theism as a cohesive, so it's joining all together, metaphysical narrative. I'm going to say it's got the most, what we call, explanatory power. If you think of what we're doing in science, we're trying to find a model of the world that explains everything. And so that's what we're doing in metaphysics. We're trying to come up with, and philosophy, we're trying to think of what is the best way to think of the world that's going to explain everything. And so here I'm not saying it's Christianity, I'm not saying it's Islam, I'm saying God, at some level God, okay? What does God explain? Let's look at all of the things it explains. It explains why the universe exists and why it exists in the way that it does, why it's ordered, why it is fine-tuned, why it appears as if it's designed. It provides a foundation for objective morals. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get to ethics next term. It provides an explanation for the origin and emergence of self-reflective life, and it does justify consciousness and free will. So it answers all of these questions that we have. Okay? And then I've got, well, what is the price tag of the opposite, of atheism? So if you're gonna say, no, reject that, well, it means you don't have an explanation for why things exist. It means you don't have an explanation for why it's ordered. You don't have an explanation for why it is fine-tuned. So we had these definitions here. Now, in our booklets, we tried to write the booklet in advance, right? So that we could have it printed, so it's one big thing. But we may make some changes to it as we're going. So for instance, today, what I've done is I've printed a page of questions that I'd rather you answer than the ones in the book. And so you can sort of stick them over the top. Today's questions, we're going to have a bit of a discussion. So we're going to begin with just by talking with one another about these three questions. And then we're going to assess the argument on its premises. So here's stage 2 of the argument. We're going to assess each premise. Now remember, just before we get into it, with deductive reasoning, right, we can't contest the conclusion, okay? The conclusion flows from the premises. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So if we're going to contest something, we're either going to contest premise 1 or premise 2. And I'd love you guys to challenge it. So challenge this idea, the universe exists. Maybe I'll just say as well, like with this one, you don't even have to argue from the universe. You can start with anything. You could even go full Cartesian, full Descartes, and say, well, a thinking thing exists, and therefore it requires an explanation. A coffee cup exists, and therefore it requires an explanation. You can go the full universe, all right, but it still applies, even if you're going to be skeptical. Something exists, and there is something rather than nothing. It requires an explanation. Doesn't require an explanation. And then when we get to the second one, let's contest these premises here. The reason for the existence of the universe cannot be contingent. Okay, let's see if we can think of some objections. So I'll hand these out, and have a bit of a discussion first, and then have a go answering these questions and stick them on top of the book.